Good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our Zoom event today, our joint policy briefing, jointly sponsored by the Institute for Policy Innovation and the Galen Institute. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. And today our Zoom policy briefing is on the inside story of Operation Warp Speed with Dr. Paul Mango. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we will be hearing more about the book and how you can get copies of the book, et cetera, during the program. The federal government and state and local governments got just about everything wrong when it came to the response to COVID. I should state that's my personal opinion, perhaps with the exception of Operation Warp Speed, which was one of those rare examples of a federal program that actually works extremely well and accomplishes its goals in a short amount of time. So we're excited to hear about that today. I appreciate all of you being with us today. I want to especially thank those of you who are friends and supporters of the Institute for Policy Innovation. I'm sure Grace Marie will extend the same thanks to her folks. We very much appreciate it. Your support makes it possible for us to do events like this. If after this event you'd like to know more about the Institute for Policy Innovation and how you can be a part, then I would ask you to get in contact with Addie Crimmins here at IPI. She's our Director of Development, and she would like nothing more than to talk to you about how you can get involved with our work going forward. And I should mention that IPI's YouTube channel is becoming quite a resource of video briefings and resources on various policy topics. During the COVID pandemic, we've done over 40 of these Zoom policy briefings on a wide variety of topics. So when you have some time, check out our YouTube channel. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at the depth and breadth of a lot of the programming that we've been able to do during the pandemic. Today's webinar is going to be moderated by Dr. Merrill Matthews and by Grace Marie Turner, the president of the Galen Institute. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over now to Dr. Merrill Matthews. Dr. Matthews?
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for the introduction. And I'm not going to speak long because we want to turn it over to Grace Marie to introduce Dr. Mango, but just welcome everybody for coming in. I am so glad Grace Marie and the Galen Institute were able to do this with us because Grace Marie is the go-to person for coalitions in healthcare. There's not a better place to go to bring conservatives together and even sometimes not so conservative people to work on healthcare and healthcare reform. So I'm so glad she was able to join us. And Grace Marie, I'm just going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. We do always try to find consensus, and you have been with us for decades now, older than you are, right? in really trying to build ideas around advancing a patient-centered health sector. And thank you so much. And thank you, Tom, for doing the heavy lifting and organizing this Zoom seminar to be able to talk about this really exciting new book that Paul Mango has written. You do so much and are really taking advantage of the Zoom virtual presentation to include many more people than otherwise could be included in these kind of sessions. I can't always make it to Texas, but I can certainly get to Zoom to participate in your forum. So thank you. And we are delighted to have with us today Paul Mango, who was the go-to guy who really ran Operation Warp Speed. And I think both Tom and Meryl are right that Operation Warp Speed is seen really as the crown jewel of the pandemic response effort. And it is an amazing story. There are a lot of books out about the pandemic and people who ran some part of it. Paul was really the man of the moment who brought decades of experience in running big operations to really overseeing on behalf of Alex Azar the Operation Warp Speed effort. The numerous photos with Paul in the Oval Office talking with the president, in the White House task force meetings, in the talking with HHS officials and all over the country to really help mobilize this effort. Paul began his advanced education as a graduate of West Point, and then he joined the Army. He was an Army Ranger. He then 82nd Airborne Division as a paratrooper. After 5 years, he left the Army, went to Harvard Business School, graduated with distinct honors, and then joined McKinsey, where he ran their global health policy initiative for several decades. And he brought this incredible experience to leading this effort, which had the top officials, the people just sort of, if you were going to central casting to staff the tasks that had to be done, you got the right people. So Paul has written a book, Warp Speed. He's going to tell you about it. It's available virtually for Kindle next month. All I have to do is Paul Mango Warp Speed Amazon, and it pops up. And the hard copies, because of supply chain issues, won't be available till May. But you can get an early read on it with the digital version. So Paul, over to you. Thank you for your heroic work, not only in running Operation Warp Speed on behalf of the President and HHS Secretary Alex Azar, but also for chronicling this vitally important, successful private-public sector initiative. So, Paul, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Grace Marie and Meryl, and thanks to IPI and Galen for hosting this. And before I get started, I should say, Grace Marie doesn't like me saying this, but the book wouldn't have been written without her persistence, because last spring we were having a little bit of trouble finding a publisher, and she called an agent that she had worked with previously, Alex Hoyt, and we found Al Regnery, and everything has fallen into place since then. But really appreciate all of that pushing, Grace Marie, and I think the American people will appreciate it once they have a chance to read the book. I thought what I'd do is, I think, just take 15 minutes or so to give you an overview of 3 or 4 issues, how it all started, how did this actually begin, which is an interesting story in and of itself. What were some of the key success factors? Why did we take a process that previously was 4.5 years, I think was the best record for bringing a safe and effective vaccine to market at scale, and this took 10 months. How did that happen? What were some of the lessons learned that we took away? And then I thought I'd finish by just saying a few words about as Grace Marie said, the folks from Central Casting, but a very unusual, shall I say, a cast of characters who came together very serendipitously to make this happen. And then I think we're going to open it up for questions after that. I think the overarching theme of the book is this is a great American achievement. It took place, obviously, in an intense political environment, a presidential election year where there was already a great deal of divisiveness in the middle of a global pandemic. And we address that in the book, but it's not a political book. I think that anyone who reads it will find it to be an uplifting book about American exceptionalism and how the government should interact with the private sector for optimal success. There's a lot of very important, what I call leadership in crisis, as well as business lessons around forming a team and so forth in the book. So if you're a healthcare executive, if you're a business executive, if you're a policy person and professional, I think you'll find some very important lessons in the book. So how did it all start? On January 3rd of 2020, I was sitting in Alex Azar's office, and Bob Redfield called and said, "We have a problem in China." That's basically how it started. And as you can imagine, the federal government had to ramp up a whole bunch of response organizations to begin to manage what became COVID-19. It didn't even have that name at the time, believe it or not. And in the early days, a lot of our focus, I think a lot of people maybe have forgotten this, but a lot of our focus was on repatriating Americans back from China and on cruise boats in the middle of the ocean. And, we shut down travel from China, but there were tens of thousands of Americans over there who wanted to get back. And we had to fly them back, coordinating with the State Department, and put them on Air Force bases and quarantine them for 14 days. So that was the early part of the response. As you know, there were some problems ramping up diagnostic testing. The CDC had a contamination issue that they had to deal with. So that we spent a lot of time on that. And all the while, 2 persons, I talk about this in the book, Dr. Peter Marks, who runs the Center for Biomedical Evaluation and Research, CBER, at the FDA, which is the center that approves or grants emergency use authorizations to vaccines. Peter Marks and Bob Kadlec, who was the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, had already begun to activate what the government calls its medical countermeasures initiatives during a pandemic. And medical countermeasures comprise vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And Peter Marks had the presence of mind to start to search globally. This was in, let's call it February, late February, early March of 2020, search the whole world for who was actually beginning to develop vaccines. And there were literally just shy of 100 candidates that were being developed, vaccine candidates, in, let's call it late February, early March, middle of March of 2020. But on March 28th, the afternoon of March 28th, I was with the secretary, and just to describe, as a deputy chief of staff, we had three persons in the chief of staff's office. One of us was with Secretary Azar every minute of the day, probably from 7 a.m. to about 11 p.m. So we split up our time, but I was sitting in his conference room with him, and someone walked in and handed me a note, said, Alex Gorski, who is the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, would like to touch base with the secretary. And I knew Alex Gorski because we were both at West Point together. And he's actually my wife's classmate from West Point, and we had stayed in contact. So I actually knew him very well. So we patched him in, and he wanted to thank the secretary for what BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority underneath HHS, for a grant that BARDA had given to J&J that day for $450 million to develop the J&J vaccine. And we had been making a few of these investments. We had already invested in Moderna at the time. So, of course, Secretary Azar puts his hand over the phone and he's asking me, do you know anything about this? And I said, no, I really don't. And it was my job to understand those things. So we hung up after Secretary Azar did the I think appropriate niceties and said, oh, of course, we're happy to help out and hope you can get a vaccine out there in the market. And we called in the BARDA folks and we asked them, what are we getting for this $450 million? And the answer was they're going to start their phase 1 clinical trials in September. Now, this was in March. So Secretary Azar, who many of you know, was a very accomplished pharmaceutical executive. He was the president of Eli Lilly US and had spent 10 years in the industry, said, this sounds way too much like business as usual. We have to change all aspects of this so that we can get vaccines to market much faster than we ever have before. So in the book, we referred to him as the architect of Operation Warp Speed. He's the one who first recognized that we could not conduct business as usual. And he got things rolling. And one of the things he insisted upon right away is we need to bring in talent from the outside. And I'll come back to the talent, Dr. Monsef Slaoui, Carlo Di Natale Stefani. We had General Gus Purna and a few others who really led the team in unbelievable fashion. But that's how it started. So we're talking about late March, March 28th, March 29th of 2020. And 6 weeks later, there was a kickoff in the Rose Garden that President Trump led at the White House. And by that time, we had already evaluated, interviewed, and hired a bunch of external parties. We had developed a strategy for what Operation Warp Speed would do. We had created an organization which divided it between development, manufacturing, and distribution. And we were actually very much off to the races, even at that time. So while it was the official launch on May 15th of 2020 on a Friday in the Rose Garden, we had already been pretty much at work for the 6 weeks prior to that, pulling all that stuff together. So that's how it started. The key success factors, just 4 or 5 key success factors. Obviously, technology and the development of the mRNA technology was very, very important. It had been under development for a decade, and somewhat serendipitously, Moderna had been working with Tony Fauci's group at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease at the NIH when the pandemic broke out. They weren't working on a COVID vaccine, obviously. They were working on some cancer treatments using the mRNA technology. But right away, when the DNA sequence of the virus was posted on January 10th of 2020, Tony and the Moderna folks said, why not? Let's give it a shot. Let's see if mRNA technology can be used to develop a vaccine. And believe it or not, within 10 days, we had a good vaccine. We didn't know it. We hadn't gone through clinical trials. Obviously, we hadn't started manufacturing, but we literally had a good vaccine on January 20th of 2020. And Moderna was already in animal trials in February of 2020. That's how fast everything was happening. So that was very important. Probably the most important, and this was Secretary Azar's part of his architecture, the most important key success factor was everything that was typically done in series in vaccine development, we're going to do in parallel. And the federal government is going to assume the financial risk for that. So what do I mean by that? Principally, it meant start the manufacturing as soon as possible, long before the FDA is going to issue any type of emergency use authorization. Begin the plan phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials before we even started phase 1 clinical trials, get the sites laid out, get the personnel trained. All of that was being done throughout the summer of 2020. And Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury at the time, came over and said to us, every day the economy is running at half speed. I lose $6 to $7 billion of federal tax revenue. So whatever you guys need to get this done, we're going to provide it for you. And eventually, Operation Warp Speed cost about $30 billion. So think about it as a 4 to 5 day return on the investment. And this was key because there were very, very few pharmaceutical companies that would have incurred the risk of spending a couple of $1 billion on manufacturing before they got any type of authorization from the FDA. But for the federal government, the return on that investment was spectacular. And in fact, that is why it was natural for us to assume that risk. So that was the second key success factor. The third one was Moncef Slaouy's strategy, and I call it a venture capital mindset. What he knew, and what we all knew, was we only needed one safe and effective vaccine manufactured at scale to win. That's all we needed. But we invested in 6. And the way we invested in 6 was 2 in each of 3 different technology platforms, mRNA, the viral vector, and the protein subunit. I think if you've been following the news, Novavax is a protein subunit vaccine, and people are expecting them to get their emergency use authorization in a week or so, or very, very soon. That was one of our investments, believe it or not. They had some problems early on with manufacturing at scale, so they never got approved while we were there, but that was one of our investments. And of course, Johnson & Johnson was a viral vector, and then the BioNTech and the Moderna were the mRNA. So that was that venture capital mindset was very important. And we, after Moncef Slaoui chose his slate of 6 candidates, we went around and we conducted what I call a cumulative probability analysis. So, okay, Moncef, you're the most successful vaccine developer in our generation, but we're going to just check with a few experts on your selected slate of 6. And we looked at 3 factors. Could they be manufactured at scale? Could they get through the FDA before the end of the year? And would they be effective in those over age 65? Because we weren't interested in a vaccine that was going to be helpful to 5-year-olds that were not really susceptible to COVID. So we went around and did a kind of a blinded interviews with a bunch of experts, and we put it into a formula, like I said, a cumulative probability analysis. This was in August. And the answer came back that we had based on Moncef's selections, we had a 75% probability of having at least one safe and effective vaccine manufactured at scale approved by the FDA before year end, and a 32% chance we'd have 2, and about an 8% chance we'd have 3, and we wound up with 2. So that venture capital mindset was very important. I think the 4th key success factor was, I call it bypassing the bureaucracy. So what do I mean by that? Well, we had a very small board of directors for Operation Warp Speed, co-chaired by Mark Esper and Alex Azar, because it was really a joint venture between the Department of Defense and and Health and Human Services, and it reported directly to the Oval Office. So we didn't report to the White House Coronavirus Task Force or anyone else. It was directly to the president. And whenever we needed a big decision made, we would just call Jared and we'd get in within hours, and the president would help us through whatever we needed, quite honestly. So that was a key success factor. And then I think the last key success factor was really what I call a leadership philosophy that had this inveterate belief in the private sector over the public sector. And we established a principle early on that said the government should not engage in anything that the private sector can do better. And we had some internal battles I talk about in the book with the CDC, who had a strong preference for using public health agencies for the distribution and administration of vaccines. But we fought that, and we thought it should be UPS and FedEx and CVS and Walgreens and a lot of the well-known retail chains where most Americans wound up getting their vaccinations. There was also a strong leadership preference for what I call teamwork over the individual. We had to deal with a couple of team issues early on, and we dealt with them, but it was just so important that everyone was behaving as a team. And then I think the last leadership principle was, we don't care what your title is, we're going to defer to your expertise, whether that's manufacturing expertise, development of vaccine expertise, distribution and logistics expertise. No one had a title. It was all about who was the expert. So those were the key success factors. I think a couple of quick lessons learned were really around assembling a group, as Grace Marie said, of very, very talented individuals, but turning them into a team very quickly. And in the book, I talk about Monsef Slaoui, very shrewd leader, who in one of our early meetings where we get everyone together, of course, there were multiple agencies from HHS, Department of Defense, private sector folks who would come in, participants from the White House, and someone would speak up and say, "Oh, I'm from the CDC." And Monsef Slaoui would interrupt anyone who said that, and he would say, "I think you meant to say you're part of the Operation Warp Speed team," which is very, very interesting leadership trait, if you will, or kind of practice. And everyone got the message very, very quickly. I think another lesson learned was really just around a compelling vision. Everyone on the team, and there were hundreds of persons fully dedicated to Operation Warp Speed from the Army and from HHS, and as I said, from the private sector. You could have asked any one of them, what are you trying to get done? And they would have said the same thing, to have at least one safe and effective vaccine manufactured at scale, approved by the FDA before year end. It was a very easy management task because everyone knew what the objective was. And that was, I think, just a characteristic of any successful operation. I think third is, I talk about this in the book, but for the business leaders who are tuning in today, I think most of you know what a skunk work is. And that's basically taking a multidisciplinary group of individuals, sequestering them from all distractions, giving them the resources they need and let them innovate. And that's what the Operation Warp Speed team was. And the lesson in the book is, if you're going to create a skunk work, let the skunks do their thing. And there's a chapter that talks about that. But we did not micromanage the team. The president didn't, the secretary didn't, I didn't, no one did. We just fed them the resources they needed to be successful. And we trusted them. And in return, they were working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week to get it done. So those were some lessons learned. And then lastly, I just want to talk about some of the characters, because in the book, I wanted to explore the backgrounds of the characters. And I have to admit, I didn't know them as well until last summer when I interviewed a lot of them for the book. And what I really wanted to understand was, how did they get to where they wound up on the Operation Warp Speed team? And there's fascinating stories. I talk about Monsef Slaoui, who was born in Morocco, educated in Belgium, and became an American citizen because he married an American woman, and came to work, by the way, for $1. He worked 10 months on the Warp Speed team for $1. But I asked him one day, I said, Monsef, why did you ever get involved with vaccines? Why was that your passion? And he told this very heartrending story about his sister who died of whooping cough, and how the family felt that. And he was really got involved in vaccines because of his sister. Very interesting story. I talk about Carlo de Notari Stefani. That's probably a name you haven't heard too much, but he was our senior manufacturing advisor. This guy had to work to either expand or stand up from scratch 27 manufacturing facilities across the US in 7 months. Just an absolute genius. And he was from right outside of Naples, Italy, studied chemistry. He was going to take over his dad's business in Italy when in the late 70s, the oil crisis destroyed this chemical business, which, you know, a lot of chemical businesses use petroleum. And that's when he got involved with pharmaceutical manufacturing. And he wound up spending 30 years at Bristol Myers Squibb and then at Teva as their senior kind of global manufacturing expert. But Carlo had a very interesting philosophy. And he said, Paul, I've done this for 30 years. He said, every time the pharmaceutical manufacturers engage in new manufacturing, they perfect each step of the process. But when they bring all the steps together, it always fails the first time. So he said, my philosophy for Operation Warp Speed Team is fail quickly. And I know a lot of business leaders understand what I'm talking about. Fail fast and then fix it. And that's exactly what he did, because he knew there was going to be problems. He just wanted to, elicit those problems early. And then Bob Kadlec, this guy, the most resourceful guy in the United States government during 2020. We used to call him Ready, Fire, Aim Bob, because he'd go out and do things, and he'd walk into the secretary's office and say, oh, by the way, I just spent $600 million buying 1 billion masks for the stockpile. And it'd be like, okay, Bob, whatever. We wish you would have asked about that in advance. But here's a guy who scrounged the world for 1 billion needles and syringes for warp speed during a global pandemic when everyone else wanted them. And he figured out a way to get them delivered to the United States. And I tell the story in the book about his parents who met in a forced labor camp in Czechoslovakia during World War II. And his mom was an American citizen who had returned to Czechoslovakia during the Depression because there was no work here. But his dad was his future dad was a Czechoslovakian or Czech citizen. And they were working in this, like I said, forced labor camp. His mom was sewing basically underwear for German soldiers on the Eastern Front. And his dad, they weren't married at the time, was packing these and sending them out in boxes. Anyway, after the war, his mom got a free pass back to the United States because she was an American citizen, but his dad didn't. So his dad had to escape through the Iron Curtain into Vienna and make his way to the States to marry his mom. And I'm like, Bob, that's where you got your DNA from, I can tell, because he was unbelievably resourceful. But I hope when you read the book, if you do read the book, that you understand that this was a very unusual group of individuals led by a secretary, I think the only secretary in history of Health and Human Services that had had a decade of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. And how lucky were we about that? No one knew we were going to have a global pandemic. So anyway, that's a bit about the book. I think for Marilyn and Grace Marie, I think we should probably open it up for some questions.
We will. Thank you so much, Paul. And Grace Marie and I will take the moderator's prerogative to toss a couple of questions out there. So I'll toss a couple and let you answer those, and then Grace Marie can come in. First, you just touched on the logistics aspect of it, the syringes and so forth. And people focus on the creation of the vaccine. But if there had not been syringes, if there hadn't been a distribution network, decisions as to how many, what states get how many, how are you going to distribute those? That was a huge project that's sort of in the background. So talk a little bit about who managed the logistics on this, because this is a big enterprise just apart from developing the vaccine. The second thing is on the patents. I think the American companies retain their patents or retain the right to retain the patents. But there was immediately challenges saying we need to be able to take these patents and put them out for other companies so that they don't retain the patent aspect of that. So talk about the logistics and the patents.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the logistics, Meryl, because the Army Materiel Command led the entire logistics part of the enterprise. And General Gus Purna, the 4-star I think a lot of people know who he is, but he had a team around him. So we had a 4-star general, Gus Purna, a 3-star general, Paul Ostrowski, a 2-star general, Chris Sharpston, and a 1-star general, Tony McQueen, and a whole bevy of colonels and lieutenant colonels and majors and captains. And the important thing to know about this group of individuals is they'd been together for close to 20 years serving combat operations, supporting combat operations in the Middle East. They knew logistics better than anyone in the world. It was clear. And I'll tell you a story about Gus Purna. Oh, I mentioned that Carlo de Notari Stefani had to expand all these vaccine manufacturing factories, and think about 2,000 liters at a time as these big vats that the vaccines are produced in. And they were only manufactured in Switzerland or Germany. And we ordered a bunch of them in the summer of 2020. And the Swiss had some extra ones. And they said, we're going to put one on a boat right away and it'll be there in 6 weeks. And Gus Purna said, I'm going to have a C-17 there tomorrow afternoon, so get ready to load it up. That's how much time we would cut off the normal logistics. And then when it arrived in the United States, he coordinated with Department of Transportation, because these are big vats that took up 2 lanes of the highway, and he'd have the interstate shut down until these trucks got to the factory. So that's how many, many months can be condensed into just a few hours. But I have to say, their planning capabilities, we probably went through 20 tabletop exercises, planned for every contingency. We procured the dry ice. We, as you said, not only had to procure, but create the kits of needles, syringes, and adjuvant, and all of the supplies that was necessary to support vaccine administration. And of course, McKesson actually executed all that, the pharmaceutical distributor McKesson, but the Army team had to work with all of these private sector companies to get them all coordinated. And then they would go out and test and make sure and verify that they were ready to do what they needed to do. We wound up enrolling 70,000 vaccine distribution sites into our information technology system during that period of time before the first vaccine was administered in December. So the Army Materiel Command and the logistics associated with factory equipment, raw materials, hiring and helping these companies hire and train personnel, getting the needles, getting the syringes, putting them in kits, merging those kits with the vaccines themselves to get them out to the country, working with FedEx and UPS on containers that could handle -80°C vaccines and send us GPS signals every 2 minutes, so we knew where every container of vaccines was at any one time. Coordinating federal marshals to accompany the shipments, the truck shipments of the vaccines from factories to the distribution hubs, because as you can imagine, there would have been a lot of people in the world, bad actors, who would have loved to have hijacked a truck full of, 500,000 vaccines, right? They did all of that. When it comes to the patents, I don't understand all the confusion over this. The companies, I know there's a little bit of a spat between the NIH and the Moderna as to who possesses all the rights to the patents and the intellectual property. But beyond that, all of these companies, BioNTech, Moderna, J&J, they were more than happy to, at no royalty, give out their recipes for their vaccines to third world countries and other manufacturers who could do contract manufacturing for them. But they did want to retain rights to the intellectual property, not for economic reasons in the short term, but because they're going to use this technology for other things in the long term. So I know there's been a lot of criticism of these companies, but I have to say, at least the ones with whom we dealt were extremely generous in their lending, if you will, of their intellectual property at no cost to countries that couldn't afford vaccines. Sure, they wanted a royalty when they're selling it to Western Europe, but they were very, very generous when they were, when it came to third world countries, and they would give it to any manufacturer at cost to manufacture that. So that one's a little bit confusing to me, Meryl, but I'm glad you raised it.
Thank you, Paul. I think that so much was going on behind the scenes that was not being told. Everything was about the controversy over testing and whether or not people were going to be masked. When this enormously complex effort was going on behind the scenes so that the vaccines could be made available, new vaccine, new technology within 10 months, when usually this takes a decade. And I think that I'm so thankful that you have written the book to be able to really chronicle this story and also to capture the importance of how successful an effort can be when government and the private sector work together rather than being at odds, but really figuring out what is the proper role for each entity and using an investor's strategy of saying, we're not going to just bet on one, we're going to look at the whole field, we're going to find the preeminent vaccine expert in the world to whittle them down to 6 that we're going to invest in. So you have competitors up front. I mean, that all of that is really historic. We haven't seen anything like that really since World War II, when you see this giant mobilization of the private sector working with the government. Tevi Troy, who was, as you know, one of your predecessors as Deputy Secretary of HHS in a previous, the George W. Bush administration, was first up with a question that I think is very relevant here. When you left, as much as you might have wished that you would have been able to hand over the expertise and the sophistication of this effort to the Biden administration, they rebuffed your efforts to even have a briefing about this. So they didn't have any idea of the complexity and the talent that was available. And they just basically took the vaccine and said, we're just going to have our policy's going to be jab, 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 right? So Tevi really has, I think, a very sophisticated question. Now that we see all these vaccine wars and the controversies that continue over the vaccine, how do you think that it might have played out differently had the Operation Warp Speed effort, this massive, hugely successful mobilization, been able to continue as we saw the virus continue to evolve, as we saw the need for treatments as well as vaccines? What might your crystal ball show about how the future could have been differently had you been able to continue with Operation Warp Speed into 2021 and 2022?
Yeah, thanks, Tevi, for that question. I'm glad you tuned in today. Let me address it a couple of different ways because I want to answer it on both sides of the equation. And in one sense, Grace Marie and Tevi, it wouldn't have changed. And what do I mean by that? They followed our distribution and administration plan almost to a T. The CDC put out a 65-page booklet, if you will, operating plan in September of 2020 that talked about 3 phases of vaccine distribution and administration. One was when supply was less than demand, one was when supply equaled demand, and one was when supply exceeded demand, and how that would roll out through the country, how many distribution sites, priorities for who would get vaccines, where they'd be administered, and so forth. The Biden folks tried a couple of things that we never would have tried, and they all failed. But they fell back on our plan and it succeeded. So in some ways, it wouldn't have been too much different. And where did they fail? Well, federally run mass vaccination sites. They wanted to set up 100. They wound up setting up 18. I talked to the Operation Warp Speed team well into the summer of 2021, and they said 1% to 2% of the total vaccinations occurred at those places. It made almost no difference, and they wound up shutting them down. The second thing they tried that we never would have tried was door-to-door knocking campaign. I don't think you've heard much about that lately, but if you remember, that was the late summer. They were going to go door-to-door and have, government contracted people knocking on our doors saying, "Did you get your vaccination yet?" Which I think was kind of foolish. And then the third thing they tried that we didn't was obviously a vaccine mandate, and we never would have done that. So the 3 things they tried that were different failed, but the plan that they wound up executing was precisely the plan we laid out. Now, where it would have been really different, and you kind of alluded to this, was when it came to therapeutics. Okay, so warp speed, I don't talk about this too much in the book because it's just too much to cover, but we also were very active with the same principles, pushing therapeutics. And remdesivir, the monoclonal antibodies, early on, we tried convalescent plasma, that didn't work, but the monoclonal antibodies from Regeneron and from Eli Lilly were actually very successful. And then we began investing in subcutaneous administration of those because no one wanted to go in to get IVs, and now there are some subcutaneous options available. We had not invested in the pill versions yet because they were still, they hadn't even started development, some of the ones that are out now. But what I heard, again, from my former colleagues was there was a moratorium put on the development of therapeutics in January after we left, because the Biden strategy was singularly focused on vaccines, and that was it. And I tell a story in the book about President Trump, for all the criticisms and all the quote mean tweets. I saw a sticker the other day in a car that said, "Bring back the mean tweets." But I think the point was, every time we went in to brief him on vaccines, he asked first question, "How are we doing on therapeutics?" And he told the story. He had 4 or 5 close friends die of COVID. And he said, I really think the American people want to know that if they get sick, we can heal them, because vaccines will never be perfect. That was his logic, which is pretty compelling. And of course, you fast forward a year and everyone's saying, how come we didn't invest more in therapeutics? We were going down that path, but the Biden administration decided they were going to put all their chips down on the vaccine. So I think that is the principal way it would have been different. But I think from distribution and administration of vaccines, they wound up precisely adhering to the plan that we put out through the CDC in September of 2020.
I will turn it over to Meryl to ask the next question in the Q&A, but I just want to also point out how wise the team was in anticipating needs far in advance, anticipating, for example, the need to keep the vaccines during transport at these ultra low temperatures, and working with FedEx, working with UPS, working with the distributors, with the manufacturers of these containers. I mean, and that had to start even before.
Started in May. It started in May of 2020.
Exactly. And knowing that you're going to need all these vials, and you're going to need vials that can withstand all these temperatures.
Yeah.
So talk about supply chain. This was really enormous challenges and part of the great story of Operation Warp Speed. So Meryl, back to you.
Thank you, Grace Marie. Lauren Hune, I believe it is, asked the question, to what extent the model, the Operation Warp Speed model, can be replicated in the future for either vaccines or perhaps for something completely different. And then I'll toss in a second question with that after you answer Lauren's. To what extent was the CDC a help or a hindrance in developing this?
Yeah. So I'm sorry, Meryl, I was focusing on your second question. What was the first question?
Lauren asked the question, to what extent the Operation Warp Speed model
can be replicated
for other things, perhaps not even involving medicine or vaccines.
Yeah, I think the principles are pretty robust, Lauren, and I articulated them a little bit before, but the role of the government should be to enable the private sector to be successful, but depend on the private sector to deliver that success. And we, what we did was actually quite limited. What we did was provide resources and assume financial risk. We set a very clear regulatory context for success. The FDA in June of 2020 laid out the precise standards of what the clinical trials should be. And then we intervened with the Defense Production Act 18 times, actually, to realign the priorities within the supply chain to what the national needs were. And it wasn't like the companies weren't doing this. It's very interesting. I was with Vice President Mike Pence a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about use of the Defense Production Act. And early on, we were being criticized for not using it. And he told the story about President Trump asking him, "Hey, Mike, how come we're not using the Defense Production Act? And his answer was, we don't have to. All these companies are cooperating, which again is a testament to American industry. But the reason we did need to use it a few times was because when we prioritized our needs, many of those companies had to break contracts with their existing customers. And what the Defense Production Act did was shield them from liability in doing that. So we provided the financial resources and assumed the financial risk, set a clear regulatory context, intervened with the Defense Production Act, and sure, we coordinated all these actors so that it would be a single team. But all of the innovation and the real execution, the delivery, I mean, FedEx and, you heard Grace Marie talk about FedEx and UPS. These guys, Fred Smith and his team at FedEx, they retrained every one of their drivers to never drop a box off of vaccines anyplace. It had to be a hand-to-hand, a warm handoff. They retrained everyone. They developed these motion-sensitive containers that could tell us whether the vaccines were, accidentally dropped or whatever. They had these GPS trackers on them where we'd get a signal every 2 minutes. McKesson redesigned its warehouses to do all this kitting. Palantir, I should mention Palantir, Peter Thiel's firm, the IT firm that developed the most sophisticated vaccine tracking system in the world in 90 days. We could tell where it was from factory to warehouse to shipping hub to final destination. We had 70,000 destinations we were eventually shipping vaccines to. We knew exactly who signed for them at what place. We knew how many of those were being used so that we could tell the governors the subsequent week, because we were giving an allocation every week. We could tell the governors, okay, last week we sent to these 100 locations in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This site has only used 10% of what we sent them. This site has used 100%. And we would present that electronically to the governors every week so that they could make decisions for the subsequent week. All of that was done by America's private sector in a very, very short period of time. Why that should be able to be done again. I mean, those are principles about what the government's role is, what the government's lane is, and what the private sector should do. And I mean, I'll just throw out two that we should be doing this for. Opioid overdose deaths, 100,000 last year, or drug overdose, I should say, but a lot of it's opioid and fentanyl. There should be a warp speed effort to address that. President Nixon and President Biden both said we're going to defeat cancer, right? It's been 50 years, I guess, since President Nixon said that. We could do some of this for cancer treatments. It's really, I think, a model, and that's, as Grace Marie said, that's part of the reason I wrote the book. It has a robust set of applications. Okay, Meryl, now that I've answered your first question, I think I forgot the second one. I'm sorry. I should be writing these down.
That had to do with the CDC. Were they a help?
Oh, the CDC, yeah. The CDC. So unbelievably dedicated public servants. Let me start by saying that. But leadership, culture, operational capability, completely ill-prepared for a global pandemic. What are they really good at? Well, people don't remember this, but in the fall of 2019, Bob Redfield and his team were spending a lot of time in the Democratic Republic of Congo fighting Ebola. Okay. And little known, in July of 2020, during the height of our pandemic, there was an article in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal that said Ebola has been eradicated in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That was a spectacular achievement. And people don't realize this, but the case fatality rate of Ebola is about 80%, right? So talk about dangerous if it ever got to the United States. And I think many people remember in 2014, we did have a few cases. The case fatality rate of COVID is about 0.2%, just to put that in perspective. So the CDC is really good at things like Ebola, but they were completely ill-prepared for this pandemic. And I think the culture is an inhibitor to them in two ways. One is it's an academic culture. And what I mean by that is, no, it's not a pejorative term to our academic medical centers, but if you go down to the CDC, the folks who advance are the people who are writing compelling articles in the MMWRs, mortality and morbidity weekly reports. And they spend a lot of time trying to do research and publish things. I found their publications to be good, but 6 months too late for pandemic, all the time. That was one cultural barrier. It wasn't an operationally focused agency. And the second one was, and I talk about this in the book, they had a strong preference for utilizing their public sector counterparts down in the public sector jurisdictions. There's 64 public sector jurisdictions. And Gus Purna and his team said, nah, I don't think so. We're going to use CVS. We're going to use Walgreens. We're not going to use the county health department as the lead agent in our vaccine distribution and administration plan. We're just not going to do it. And Gus and his team won that argument. And we are where we are, which I think is a great place. So yeah, great, history. I wrote an op-ed on this a couple of weeks ago. The things they've done over time with polio and malaria, but they're just an anachronism now. They're out of their historical time frame, and I think they need to modernize quickly before we face another pandemic.
Just to follow up on that, Congress has been demanding that the CDC update its tracking technologies since 2006. Yeah. And they have provided in Congress after Congress, Republicans and Democrats, money for the CDC to track information instead of collecting it via fax machine. So that is really, I think, just an evidence that, yes, there are some things they can do well, but there are a lot of things they need to do much better. Go ahead. You want to follow up?
I'm just going to, Grace Marie, you prompted a thought, and that is the data coming through the public health agencies is already old, because guess where the local public health agency gets it? From the local hospital or physician offices. So what I have been proposing is we've spent tens of billions of dollars, and you know this as well as anyone, wiring the U.S. healthcare system with, electronic health records and meaningful use to reinforce the fact that you're only going to get paid if you use those electronic health records. What we wound up doing was developing a workaround system called HHS Protect, and we used a company called Teletracking to give us multiple times a day feeds from every hospital in the country telling us who was admitted with COVID, who's in the ICU with COVID, who's on a ventilator with COVID, who was discharged with COVID, who died with COVID. So I'm not sure we should go through the public health sector to gather information. We should go directly to the source and then feed that back to every public health agency in the country. But anyway, that's just I think that's where that should go eventually.
Once again, devolving power and control as low as possible. So we have a question from Bob Hyde, and it follows up a little bit on something you alluded to earlier. Was there any international development collaboration between the American team, the EU, and Asian countries? So that's number one. And then he also said, was it an impediment that you did not know confirmatorily where ground zero was for this virus? So yeah. Two questions, international cooperation and ground zero.
Yeah, so I think as people remember, the World Health Organization was not helpful early on in the pandemic. And in fact, in February, I don't have the exact date, but it was relatively early in February, Bob Redfield and HHS sent a team of folks over to Wuhan to see what was going on, because we wanted to get to the bottom of it, and they wouldn't let any of them into the Institute of Virology over there. They did let them land in Wuhan, the region, but they wouldn't let them in the Institute of Virology. And the World Health Organization was pretty feckless when it came to pushing for that. So what did we do? So Secretary Azar, through Garrett Grigsby, who was our Office of Global Affairs leader within HHS, we set up a call with the G8 health ministers every other week for the year of 2020. And we did these, I remember, at 8 a.m, because that would have meant it was 8 p.m. in Tokyo. And the Japanese health minister was one of the participants. And they spent an hour every other week exchanging lessons learned and best practices. So what's going on in your country, what worked, what didn't work. It wasn't really focused on warp speed or vaccines nearly as much as it was focused on pandemic response. to answer the question about, so Secretary Azar took the leadership role of organizing the G8 health ministers, and they exchanged kind of lessons learned and best practices every other week. And that was great. It didn't, it helped us quite a bit. I don't think the lack of knowing the origin of the virus affected vaccine development at all. It really wasn't. I mean, the DNA of the virus was posted on January 10th, and that's all the vaccine development world needed to get started on it. So it didn't really make much difference to us, but I think it makes a world of difference in terms of pandemic readiness and the next time around. And again, I mentioned I was with Bob Redfield a couple of weeks ago, and he has a very compelling point of view that this was an engineered virus. And what he says, which was very interesting, he says SARS and MERS, which was 2003 and 2012 respectively, they're still circulating, and a grand total of fewer than 10,000 humans have been infected with each of those viruses, fewer than 10,000. And then you have the coronavirus, who I think Bob would say by January of 2020, we already had hundreds of thousands of Americans infected. We just didn't know it, right? And he said, he's one of the world's leading virologists, and he would say that what he did say was, there's not a virus that can transmit human to human that effectively coming only from nature. It had to be engineered. So he has a pretty compelling point of view on that. And I think it's vital to understand it for the next pandemic and our readiness, but it did not impact negatively vaccine development.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Meryl, but I know I speak for many, many people who've had COVID who said, this is not like anything I've had before. This really is a very different kind of virus. So I agree with that. Meryl, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Grace Marie. David Cam asked the question about vaccine equity. The World Health Organization immediately started coming out and saying we need to make sure we get a number of these vaccines to low-income countries, poor countries, and so forth. And as I was looking at it, when Pfizer came out with theirs and they talked about the cold, the temperatures you had to keep some of these down to, the fact that you had to get 2 as opposed to 1, it just seemed like it was going to be hard for at least the mRNA to be very useful in poor countries that didn't have the infrastructure, the material, and so forth. So I thought Johnson & Johnson might be a little better for them. But talk about the vaccine equity issues, because there was going to be pressure for us to make sure that other countries had these free of charge based upon us just donating some of them, which may have been fine. I just want to get your feedback on that from David Cam's position.
Yeah, and in July of 2020, again, Alex Azar, presence of mind, turned to Garrett Grigsby in a meeting we were having and said, Garrett, I need you to start developing an international distribution strategy now, because it looks like from the phase 2 clinical trial results, we're going to have some good vaccines and everyone in the world is going to want to get their hands on them. So Garrett Grigsby worked all fall with the National Security Council, Brian Kavanaugh over at the National Security Council, and State Department representation as well, on how we would prioritize distribution of vaccines outside the United States. And they came up with 4 different categories, starting with strategic partners, those who are helping us with clinical trials, third world countries that could not afford them themselves, and then all other except China and Russia. Quite literally, that was the sequence in the 4 categories. On December 8th, in December 8th, 2020, we held a vaccine distribution summit in the South Court Auditorium of the White House. And at that summit, President Trump issued an executive order that reinforced what I just described and said, I want a plan propagated within 30 days for how we're going to vaccinate the rest of the world. And I think the metaphor I would use is the following. He was criticized at the time, but when you're on an airplane, the flight attendants say, if we lose oxygen, you put your oxygen mask on first, and then you take care of your children. There's a reason for that. That was the strategy, and that was the philosophy of the Trump administration. We were going to vaccinate Americans first, and then we're going to take care of the rest of the world. And that's what that executive order said on December 8th of 2020. So we never got to execute that plan, but what I understand is that the Biden administration largely carried it out. Now, you raised a question, Marilyn, a very good question about Pfizer versus Johnson & Johnson, and I'll just give you some facts. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine can be stored at refrigerated temperatures. The Pfizer vaccine, as you said, is minus 80 degrees Celsius, which is, kind of extreme cold storage. One of the things Gus Purna and his team did, and one of the things in conjunction with the CDC in the fall of 2020, was survey the American public health jurisdictions to find out where we had minus 80 degree capable freezers, just in the United States, forget about the third world. And largely it was determined that it was hospitals that had them. They were the most prevalent institutions that had them, but not many others had them. Obviously, the pharmaceutical distributors had them and a few others. So the concern is the third world would not be able to store and distribute the Pfizer vaccine that easily. And we had a strong preference for Johnson & Johnson because not only could you store it at refrigerated temperatures, but it was a single dose. You didn't have to get people back for their second dose. And then one other fact that would have influenced us is Johnson & Johnson, great, as you know, a great American company. Early on, they said to us in the trials, they said, listen, we think this could be one dose. It might be two, but we think it's going to be one, and we're going to charge you $10 a dose if it's one dose. However, if it's two doses, we're going to cut that in half and charge you $5 a dose. So effectively, what they were committing to was $10 per vaccinated person. At the time, Pfizer's vaccine was $19.50 a dose, so $39 per vaccinated person. And then, for whatever reason, in the summer of 2021, the Biden administration agreed to give Pfizer $5 more per dose. This was in the Wall Street Journal, $24.50 a dose, or $49 per vaccinated person. And then it put in an order of 500 million doses for international distribution. So that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, to pay 5 times as much per vaccinated individual for a vaccine that was harder to store, harder to distribute, and because of 2 doses, harder to administer. But maybe someone will write a book about that someday.
Thank you, Paul. A few more questions. Bob Hyde, who Meryl texts me, is Henry Hyde's son, who lives in the Dallas area. So welcome, Bob. Thank you for joining us. Who asks about, and you alluded again to this earlier, about will there be, or are there any similar government undertakings to develop the treatments? And is it something that not just for COVID, but that you think could, I guess, Michael, the way really to think about it is, would this administration do anything like that? Can you imagine Operation Warp Speed coming together in the Biden administration, which has a very different mindset, and for the treatments that are needed now?
Well, I think the facts bear out the answer to the question, Grace Marie, and Bob. I think you said Bob was the one who posed that question. I read about Paxlovid, Molnupiravir, and then the latest Eli Lilly. I think it's called Beta Lamivir. It's a monoclonal antibody. About these are breakthrough treatments, either oral ingestion, or it can deal with Omicron. And then I read in the article, it says, oh, and the government put in a 20 million dose order, and it'll be ready by September of 2022. And I'm thinking, if this were Operation Warp Speed, within 24 hours of the time it was approved, we would have been distributing tens of thousands of doses of this stuff. So the Biden administration has obviously not embraced the principles of Operation Warp Speed, which is to engage in manufacturing at risk, meaning you start manufacturing this stuff early on, and it's ready when the emergency use authorization is granted. And you say, well, maybe they're more risk averse, but I'm thinking these therapeutics had to go through phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials before they got into phase 3 clinical trials. I'm just guessing, based on the spectacular performance of, let's say, Paxlovid from Pfizer, I'm just guessing the phase 2 clinical trials demonstrated huge efficacy. So why didn't they start manufacturing then? So I don't understand. I think it's, again, I come back to, you had a president who came from the private sector, who was a business person, inveterate belief in the private sector. You had Alex Azar, 10 years in the pharmaceutical industry as an executive, inveterate belief in the private sector, right? So you had, and then, obviously the folks who were leading the Warp Speed team, like Monsef Slaoui and others, came from the private sector. So I think it was, as you mentioned, just a different philosophy about it. And I think the latest example is these home administered tests. So, government website, U.S. Postal Office, U.S. Postal Service rather than FedEx and UPS. I hear that a lot of them were compromised because the formula in the tests can't handle sub-freezing weather, and a lot of them were delivered in sub-freezing weather. I ordered mine on January 18th. I still don't have them. I don't know what today is, what is a month later. So again, they kind of go back to big government and the government's role rather than the government simply enabling our more innovative private sector to be successful. So I don't have a lot of confidence. It's going to change under this administration, but hopefully the book will encourage the next administration to think differently.
Tevi Troy did a program yesterday with the Bipartisan Policy Center on the presidency. And I think that this is really a crucial test of the success of a presidency. One of the speakers very effectively talked about how much attention is given to communications, and yet really the places where they fail are on implementation.
Yeah.
And they used a lot of examples. They used a lot of very profound examples, including the Obama administration's failure to produce a website to be able to get people to register for Obamacare. And I think that maybe one of the really important lessons to be learned from Operation Warp Speed is the attention to implementation, and that President Trump not only had that mindset as a businessman, but he continued to understand that in order for those of you with the boots on the ground to get this done, he needed to make quick decisions in order to be able to facilitate that and to open doors for you whenever possible. And that really gets to what may be our last question, is Lauren McQuillan is asking, how much of the success of Operation Warp Speed was due to government subsidies and how much due to deregulation? And on the deregulation side, what was most important?
Yeah, on the deregulation side, there was one very important aspect. I guess it's not even deregulation, but is an item called the PrEP Act. And what the PrEP Act does is it indemnifies the pharmaceutical companies in times of public emergencies against liability suits. And this was very important. It's in every one of our contracts with these companies. And in fact, going back to the question about international distribution, one of the big hesitations the pharmaceutical companies, the manufacturers had about us distributing vaccines internationally, and they made it a precondition for us doing that, was extension of the PrEP Act protection against liability during a public health emergency. So that was I think the single most important contractual element to the success of Operation Warp Speed. But the FDA, from a more of a regulatory standpoint, the FDA was extremely meticulous and clear early on about its expectations for what it would take to pass the standards of emergency use authorization. So for instance, in June of 2020, Peter Marks put out a letter, a guidance that basically said, you have to have a minimum of 30,000 persons in your phase 3 clinical trial. Also, and I talk about this in the book, those 30,000 persons have to be of a certain distribution. Just giving you some rough numbers, 25% need to be above age 65, 10% need to be African-American, 10% need to be Hispanic. And that clarity, it was kind of the regulatory clarity that permitted the companies, because as you know, any private sector company in healthcare, Grace Marie, you've seen this for decades as I have, once they understand what the regulatory rules are, they optimize around those rules. So I think those were the two things that helped most on the, kind of regulatory front. The subsidies were vital. Moderna never could have done what it did as a small company that never had a product to market. They never could have invested billions of dollars up front in manufacturing without EUA approval. So the subsidies and assuming that financial risk was absolutely vital. Guaranteeing for Pfizer, it was a $2 billion contract guaranteed purchase of 100 million doses. That gave all of these companies the financial confidence that their investments would not, cause them to violate their fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders, so to speak. So the subsidies were very, very important, so to speak, and the regulatory and the legal protection and the clarity from the FDA was also instrumental, but probably not as instrumental as the financial subsidies.
Well, Paul, we're going to wrap it up now because we've come to the end of our time, but I want to thank you so much for your effort. And just the people criticized Operation Warp Speed from the beginning. They said it was a Trump vaccine and so forth, but y'all were able to step in there and create something that had really never been done before in record time and record quality. It's just, Grace Marie, it's just amazing how well this thing came out with all the skeptics, even experts who were so skeptical of it initially.
Right. And I think Paul has said that some people call it a miracle. Nothing, I mean, God's hand was no doubt in this with all of the wonderful people that came together, but it was an enormous amount of hard work and expertise that came together and really an historic effort. And thank you, Paul. You're just terrific. A wonderful presentation. The chat room is filled with people saying they're going to buy the book. One asked whether it's going to be an audio book. You said it was going to be available for Kindle and digitally in the middle of next month. But what about audio? What about that?
Yeah, I answered that question and I did it incorrectly. I thought they meant digital. No, we have not recorded an audio book yet. We need to do that, but as you know, Grace Marie, Al and his team don't do that, so we have to find a third party to do that for us. But yeah, we're looking forward to the release on March 15th of the Kindle version, and then in May on the book version. And I'll be coming through Washington, D.C. for anyone who's there, and probably doing something at the end of April that Secretary Azar is going to sponsor, and be happy to sign books. We'll actually have some for sale at the end of April. They won't be on Amazon yet, but we're going to bring them to some of these events.
Well, it's a real page turner, everybody. I will tell you that the stories that Paul has told today only scratch the surface of this really historic story. We all need to know about it, mostly because it's part of our current experience. But this is going to be studied in business schools for hopefully years, so that people can understand the real uniqueness and historic nature of Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah, and Grace, maybe I just. I'm sorry, Meryl. I just wanted to say
you essentially created a miracle.
Yeah, I think though, one reason why I hope some people would want to read this is it's a great uplifting story about America.
Yeah.
This is a tough environment we're in right now, as you know, very divisive, a lot of criticism, a lot of self-reflection about the country. I think if you read this book, you'll come away with a renewed feeling of pride in the country again. So I hope that's part of the reason people want to read it.
Well, thank you again, Paul. Thank you again, Grace Marie and the Galen Institute for your efforts in this. As I mentioned earlier, this is being recorded, so it will be available. It'll take a day or two for us to get it ready, but it'll be available on the website at IPI, and I suspect even perhaps at Galen. So people can either share it with others or look at it again if they want to catch up with it. And we'll look forward to the book coming out. I've got my advanced copy, but we're looking forward to the real book making it out. I want to thank all of you who've joined us. You can always go to IPI. We do these fairly frequently on these Zoom events, so you can go to ipi.org and find out more about it. And with that, we'll close it out. Thank you all.